Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to share how I created this slimline card using the new Jeepers Creepers cling mounted stamp. I started out with a piece of cardstock that measures 3¼ by 8¼ I used some washi tape to hold my brick pattern stencil in place, and then I used Ranger texture paste just to add some texture to the front of that card panel. One little trick here is to apply the texture paste in the same direction as the bricks. That way I made sure not to get any of the texture paste underneath the stencil where I didn't want the texture paste to be. I also didn't want the whole front of it covered with brick, so I just kind of did kind of a jaggedy, wonky application of the texture paste. Now, this is the first thing that I did backwards while I was creating this card, because after I had done the stenciling, I decided that I wanted more texture on that wall because I didn't add quite enough brick. So I pulled out the military camouflage background stamp and inked that up with a craft colored ink, and then I placed my stenciled panel right on top of that. And by the way, that texture paste was completely dry before I did the stamping. And even though I did this backwards where I stamped after I did the stenciling, that stamp actually added a little bit more depth and texture to the actual bricks. So I was pretty happy with how that turned out. I set that panel aside and I had stamped out the jar from the Atlas jar stamp set first. And that was the second thing that I did backwards. I should have stamped the eyeballs first because it's a cling stamp, and then stamped the jar because it's a clear stamp. But I did it backwards. I already had the jar stamped out, and I decided I was going to figure out a way to get those eyeballs in the jar. So I grabbed a piece of acetate and I stamped the eyeballs onto that acetate with a dye-based ink. Next, I put my stamped jar in my MISTI, placed the acetate on top of that so I could see about where the eyeballs were going to be stamped inside the jar. Once I had the stamp positioned on top of the acetate, I closed my MISTI lid to pick up the stamp, and then I removed the acetate, and then I used gray ink to stamp the eyeballs inside the jar. The reason that I used the gray ink to stamp the eyeballs was to push them back a little bit so that they did look like they were inside of the jar rather than sitting on top of the jar. To add a little bit of color to my eyeballs, I used one purple marker and one green marker and just colored in the irises. Once I had all of the irises colored in, I used my C7 marker and did a dot in the center of each eye to darken up the pupil. Next, I moved on to coloring in the lid of the jar, which I started with C7 and started from the outer edges and worked my way towards the center, pretty much following the lines of the threads on the lid of the jar. I blended that out with C5, but I made sure to leave a highlight kind of in the center of that jar just so that it would appear to be more round. And then I finished that up with C3. Then I came back in with C5 just a little bit on these outer edges just to add a little bit more darkness because the C3 blended it out so much. Then I decided that I had to add shadows to the eyeballs that were inside the jar just to make it appear even more that they were inside the jar instead of sitting on top of the jar. So I started with C3 and went around the areas of the eyeballs that were behind other eyeballs. Once I had all of those shadows laid out with the C3, I came in with C1 and blended it out just a little bit. And then I finished up those shadows with a C00. And I chose to use the C00 so that it would add a tiny bit of color. I didn't want to use my colorless blender because I will be bringing that in later on. And had I used the colorless blender now, then it would have just wiped out the shadows on the eyeballs themselves when I came in with the colorless blender again a second time later on in the video. Anyway, moving right along. To color in the jar, I started out with BG10 and I just added just a tiny little dash line up on the top edges and towards the center, but not very far, just a little. And then I went down the sides of the jar, but I didn't go right up against the black stamped line. I made sure to leave white space on the outer edges just to have that more of a reflection type of look. Next, I came in with BG quadruple 0 and thickened up the line of the BG10 going towards the center of the jar, again leaving that white line down right next to the black stamped line. And then on the top of the jar, in not quite the center, it's more off to the right, I added an extra little reflection there, and then I went from the bottom of the jar up to kind of try to get that reflection line lined up a little bit. Then underneath the eyeballs at the bottom of the jar, I colored all of that in with the BG quadruple 0. Then I added some C1 underneath the eyeballs to make it a little bit darker, blended that out with C0, and then after that I went over the whole jar with the colorless blender just to get rid of any of the extra harsh lines, and decided that the shadows underneath the eyeballs at the bottom of the jar weren't quite dark enough, so I came back in with C3, C1, and BG quadruple 0. To add just a little bit more reflection on one side of the jar, I scribbled my Zig Cartoonist pen on an acrylic block, and then with a damp paintbrush, I just drew a line down the one side of the jar. Once it dried completely, it gave kind of a frosty reflection look, and I was really happy with how that reflection mark turned out. One thing I noticed when I stamped out the bunch of eyeballs is there's a tiny little circle at the top of each of the irises, and I think that those are also meant to be reflection marks. So I just took a white gel pen and colored in all of those little circles. After I had everything colored on that jar of eyeballs, I used my scissors just to fussy cut out that image. And after I had done the fussy cutting, I did use a black marker to go around the edges just to cover up any not so perfectly clean cuts. Next, I used the ATC Antique Frames die set and cut a little sign for my apothecary, and I stamped the words Jeepers Creepers in a really dark brown ink. To stamp the word apothecary, I used the Alpha Mini stamp set, and I did that off camera just so you didn't have to suffer and watch me try and line up those little letters, which actually turned out to be easier than I thought it would be. Anyway, I decided to add a little bit of ink blending on the outer edges of my apothecary sign, so I used my vintage photo ink pad for that. And I had also cut a couple of more little labels so I could have labels on my jar, and I used the same Alpha Mini stamp set to stamp the words Eye of Newt for my jar with the purple and green eyeballs, and I adhered that to the front of the jar, and I used my scissors just to trim off the edges because they hung off a little bit. And I did stamp a second jar and colored all of the eyeballs orange so that I could have spider eyes as well. To ground my jars a little bit, I stamped the same military camouflage background stamp onto a piece of dark brown cardstock and adhered that to the stenciled panel at the bottom. Of course, I put a bunch of foam tape on the back of the jars and my Jeepers Creepers apothecary sign and added those to the front of the panel. And then to add a little bit more to my sign, I stamped the individual eyeballs and colored those in with my Copic markers, and I adhered that whole panel to the front of a brown note card that started out at 8.5 by 7. I scored it at 3.5 inches on the 7-inch side, so my finished card is 8.5 by 3.5. And that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.